Good morning, everyone. I'm Pastor Roger. Today we're going to finish the book of Esther. And the book of Esther ends with a fight and a feast. How's that sound? And all the kids said, "You mean there's sword fights in the Bible?" Oh, yeah. And we're going to read about one today. And by the way, the pot roast is on the way. We want you to stay for the feast. We want to feed you. And I see lots of tasty desserts out there. So please stay and feast with us and just enjoy this morning together. So let's finish the book of Esther. We'll look at chapter 9. The title today is God's Watchful Providence, as we've seen all through the book of Esther. And then at the end of the sermon, we're going to have some fun together. We're going to sort of have some audience participation as we do the story of Esther in 6 minutes. And I think you'll enjoy that. Well, it's D-Day in the Persian Empire. The date is March 7th, 473 BC. It's the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. I call it D-Day because this is the day that was decreed by the evil man Haman to destroy and kill all the Jewish people, men, women, and children. That's not very nice, is it? But it's also D-Day because another decree went out in the Persian Empire from Esther and Mordecai that the Jewish people could defend themselves on this day. So it's Destroy Day and Defend Day, all coming to a head as we look at Esther chapter 9, verse 1. Let's see what happened. Esther 9, verse 1. So on March 7th, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. That's a kind of a summary statement of what happened on D-Day. There it is, 4 verses, and basically D-Day's over. It's over. So let's eat. Amen. It just says the Jews overpowered their enemies, and you get the idea that most people were too afraid to even fight them. Because there was a guy now, Mordecai, prime minister, the Jewish guy. No, they didn't want to make him upset. It reminds me a little bit of what happened on March 30th, 1981. Anybody remember what happened on March 30th, 1981? President Ronald Reagan was shot. And then when they got him to the hospital, they were prepping him for surgery. And then he jokes with the medical team. He says, "I sure hope all of you are Republicans." And then one of the doctors said to him, "Mr. President, today all of us are Republicans." Isn't that the spirit? Oh, I miss those days. And, and that's the attitude here in the Persian Empire on D-Day, March 7th. It says the nobles, the officers, the governors, the officials, whatever their race or class or wherever they lived, from India to Ethiopia, they all came to the Jewish people's defense. Everybody came together. Isn't that nice? They came together and they said, today all of us are Jews. We're going to stick up for our neighbors. And they did. And they stopped this cruel genocide that was planned against their neighbors. So now the rest of the book of Esther is just mopping up the details. There's a score to be settled, and then the feasting has to begin. So let's see what happens next. Verse 5. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. And then we have the score. The scorecard says 500 men in Susa were struck down, verse 6. The 10 sons of Haman, he's the bad guy, they were struck down, verse 10. 300 more men in Susa, verse 15. And then it must have taken a while to add up this score, but 75,000 through the whole empire, from India to Ethiopia. That's a big number, isn't it? They were struck down with the sword, verse 16. But it says they did not take any plunder. So notice, there's no details about the fighting, just the stats. And what does that tell us again? It was just an overpowering victory that day. Millions of Jewish people probably never had to lift a sword, and when they did, their enemies died. Some estimate there may have been 10 or 15 million Jewish people saved on that day. There's a couple details here. It does say the men were killed. Nothing is said of women and children being killed. Remember, that's what the decree said. Women and children is awful. It just says the men. And those men who attacked. And then 3 times it says they didn't take any plunder, so this was a non-profit war. Remember, we've been following the money all through Esther. There's no money in this. This isn't about the money. And it wasn't about needless bloodshed, too. It was all self-defense. It was just a one-day battle just to end this hostility driven by an evil and racist man named Haman so that everybody could live in peace again. And that's what happened. Mission accomplished, right? Except there was one problem. Verse 11. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they've done that here, what's happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I'll do it. Esther responded, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do again tomorrow, as they have done today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa. Now, what's gotten into Esther? Has power corrupted her? Has the queen gone mad? Why does she want more blood? Well, remember, the Jewish people were allowed by law to fight against those who were attacking them. So we can only assume the enemy is still attacking them in the capital city of Susa. I mean, that's where the swamp was, right? So the battle is still going on in Susa. She needs another day. She must have had intel of resistance fighters in Susa. Maybe they were the friends and family of Haman, probably. And she knows they're never going to make peace. They're never going to make peace. So this has to come to an end. And those 10 sons of Haman, they're impaled on that pole that Haman built for Mordecai. And that sent a message, didn't it? In the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew text of this story, the 10 names of the sons of Haman, there in verse 7, 8, and 9, they're written in the margin. They're not even written in the main text. They're in the margin. And people wonder, why did they do that? Well, it's almost as if they were set apart for destruction by God. And then I read that Karen Jobes, who did a commentary here on this book, she explained that the names of the 10 sons have occult origins. So that extra day of fighting for Esther, that would deliver the city of Susa from these dark forces of evil, dark spiritual forces of evil. I read this week that during World War II, Hitler didn't like the story of Esther. And if he ever caught Jewish people reading the book of Esther, they would die. But of course, many of them had it memorized. So they kept telling the story, because in the end, the Jewish people would survive, even in that Holocaust, just as they survived this Holocaust in Persia. Well, on October 16th, 1946, 10 Nazi leaders were hung in the gallows at Nuremberg. Does that sound familiar? One of them, when he was led up to the scaffold, shouted out something. What did he shout? Purim Feast, 1946, he shouted out. He was thinking of Esther and Haman's 10 sons. So Esther understood that fierce action was necessary as a final chapter in this holy war that God had initiated long ago from the time of Moses. God had ordered that these specific enemies, the Amalekites, who then became the Agagites, and now they had become Haman's clan, they had to be eliminated, and Esther is a warrior queen now. How far she's come. And she would finish the job that King Saul and King David and King Hezekiah failed to finish. I guess it proves that sometimes when God needs something done in the world, he calls a woman to finish it. And there's a little bit of political satire here too, and irony, because you do remember at the beginning of the book of Esther, the king made a decree that all the wives needed to listen to their husbands. Well, what's happening at the end of the book? The husband, the king, is doing everything Esther wants him to do. G.K. Chesterton said, humor can get under the door while seriousness is still fumbling at the handle. So the humor in Esther helps us to laugh when things were so dark and so impossible and so evil. But God turned it all around, didn't he? So let me give you my 4 takeaways from this study through the book of Esther. Number 1, God's providence does not negate human responsibility. Nowhere in the Bible do you see this perfect, mysterious blending of 2 undeniable truths. God is sovereign. Humans are responsible. We can't explain it, but we see how true it is in the book of Esther. Yes, Esther risked her life. True? Mordecai refused to bow. Haman's pride caused his fall. Xerxes made his decree. But all through the story, God's providence guaranteed his will would be done. What a mystery. And we see it in the New Testament too. Philippians 2, 12 and 13. Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. There's the mystery again. We work, but it's God who's working. Isn't that beautiful? And Edmund Burke said, all that's necessary for evil to succeed is that good men do nothing. God will hold us responsible if we do nothing for him in his world. We are responsible, yet he's in control. I saw this meme on Facebook a few weeks ago. God is in control, but he doesn't expect you to lean on a shovel and pray for a hole. Thanks, Nathan. Second, when God's people are exiled in a godless land, the path forward is to pray, work, and bless the city. That's what Jeremiah said back in Jeremiah 29:7, when God's people were sent to exile. He said, build houses, have babies, plant a garden. And then he said, work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I send you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. And that's what Esther and Mordecai did. Life was better for everyone. Israel, why did God bring about Israel in the first place? He chose them to be a blessing to the whole world. But the nation drifted from God. They went into exile. I think of our country, America. We were founded by Christians. But our nation has drifted far from God too. We've become a very secular and godless nation in many places. It's like we're living in Persia now. And in some places, Christians are not very favored, are they? Almost by decree. What is the path forward for us now that things have changed for us in the church? It's the path of Esther and Mordecai. The path forward is to pray and to work and to bless our town. And yes, if necessary, even to defend our liberties, even our property, if it comes to that. Because sometimes the state just gets too drunk with power and cruel hate, just as it was at the time of King Xerxes. Third, now is not the time to remain silent. Oh, our favorite, maybe most familiar verse in Esther is chapter 3, verse 14, when Mordecai says to Esther, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. That's what we remember, for such a time as this. I think studying the book of Esther right now is providential. Esther helps us to get our spine back and the hope back that we need, and just to think that we can make a difference in the world. I said a few weeks ago I was going to really try to stay positive when I went through the book of Esther, and I am. I'm still trying to stay positive, and I'm positive things are going to get worse, especially if we remain silent. And we don't work hard and pray and try to bless our crummy town and make it better, right? Not that you live in a crummy town. I didn't mean to say crummy town. But sometimes the town is crummy unless we work to make it better, right? Max Lucado, he's a lot more positive than I am. He said, what if you, like Esther, have an opportunity to act in a way that will bless more people than you could imagine? That's hope. And last but not least, God is still on the throne. And maybe of all the lessons of Esther, that's the most important. Brian Gregory said, the subtle point of the whole satirical episode is that ultimately Ahasuerus, that's Xerxes, he's not really king of the world after all. God is. God is the one who truly sits on the throne, and that's the whole point of Esther, and that's really good for us to remember too. And Proverbs 16:33 says, we may throw the dice, the Purim, but the Lord determines how they fall. And let's just remember, brothers and sisters, our lot in life is not determined by chance. We're not here by accident. Our lot in life is not determined by what evil people do or try to do to us either. Our lot in life is under the control of God's watchful providence. God is still on the throne. Amen? We need to remember that. And laugh a little bit more, too. That would help. So we've come to the end of the book of Esther. And Esther and Mordecai established this festival. It's called the Festival of Purim. Purim is the Persian name for dice. And isn't that interesting? They would call their festival Purim, Because when Haman, that evil guy, shook the dice, he was choosing the day to destroy them. So it's kind of an in-your-face festival. Hey, come to Purim. You know, that's the day you were going to try to kill us. Well, we're still here. So come on over and eat pot roast with us on this festival of Purim. And all over the world, Jewish people celebrate Purim. It happens about a month before Easter every year, and they fast and they feast. And you know what they do? They reread the story of Esther, the whole thing, and they have a lot of fun. They make a lot of noise doing it.